Hello and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa. I'm your host, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with William Grazione, head coach of The Educated Dieter. Welcome to the show, William.
Thank you very much for having me, Lisa. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm excited to have a conversation.
Same here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about all things fat loss, muscle gain, functional health, and so on. But before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so it's pretty deep rooted, but I would say that my passion starts coming from a very overweight and obese family. Growing up as a young kid, watching the adults in your life inject themselves with insulin, I realized that that wasn't the path to health. Everybody was around 300 pounds, my grandfather, my uncle, and my mom. And I just realized that I didn't want to live that life. I realized that if I exercised and I ran and I lifted weights, that I could transform my body in a more holistic sense, just taking care of myself, even being a young athlete. And so that's where it started. It all started by me observing what my family was doing and me kind of recognizing that I wanted to be an athlete. I wanted to look like an athlete. And initially, as a young boy, like I was enamored by the physiques of like the Ninja Turtles and stuff, they had the big muscles and everything. And I was like, I want to look like that. And when I started to get into exercise, I was just very infatuated with it. I played football, started football around like 12, played all the way up until I graduated from college. And that, being a good athlete blessed me with the ability to get an education. And then after that, I got into the sport of natural bodybuilding. I became an NGA professional natural bodybuilder in 2010. And then I also became an IFPA, which is an International Federation Natural Pro Bodybuilder 2012. My very first mentor and guide was a gentleman I'm sure all of your listeners will know. His name is Dr. Lane Norton. He was my very first guide, my very first mentor, and a dear friend of mine. I love the guy to death. And then after that, I was a bodybuilding contest prep coach for the better part of probably 7, 8 years, flying to the shows, driving to the shows, being at the shows every weekend, helped a lot of people turn pro. But what I realized at about 2015, 2016 was that the sport in and of itself, due to the extremism of it, was forcing a lot of women into secondary hypothalamic amenorrhea. And I basically had to figure out, okay, what's this problem? Is this a real problem? And then can I actually help women solve this problem? And that was my introductory step into the realm of functional medicine, is the fact that I had to start helping women regain their periods. And in my first year of doing that, I was successfully able to help over 50 women regain their periods in that first year. And then after that, I realized like hypothalamic amenorrhea isn't the only, you know, metabolic adaptation side effect that these women are dealing with. You had some women with hypothyroidism, you had other women developing PCOS, women that were on birth control coming off of it, women with gut health problems and all that kind of stuff. So then I just invested in my own education to go back and learn more about everything that I didn't know about. And truthfully, injecting myself into that world of more functional, it just completely blew my mind because, in all honesty, I thought I knew everything about evidence-based macro coaching, which I was very good at. But it's all the stuff you can't see that seemed to become the problem. And so for the last 5, 6 years, I've really invested myself into kind of being a jack of all trades where, yes, I can help an individual lose body fat. But more importantly than that, we can also help individuals recover from that and help them essentially reach a place where they look good, they feel good, they can eat enough calories to not be starving all the time, and they're hormonally balanced, which I believe is the key to becoming an educated dieter. And I also believe that that is I guess you would say, that is everything that's required to maintain the results that you've worked so hard for, right? Like a lot of people can lose some weight, 15, 20, 30 pounds, but then they gain it back. Why? I think a lot of that is due to the root causes of what's happening from a hormonal perspective and a gut health perspective, an adrenal perspective, and all of that, which is why they can't maintain it because they're forcing too much adaptation. And so we've basically shown up in the space to help resolve that adaptation.
I think it's so beautiful how you're marrying those two worlds, or how they're coming more and more together, the performance of, or just generally physique sport, and people wanting to focus on aesthetics and at the same time gut health. And I think for a long time that was kind of seen as two very separate areas. And it's
Yeah.
beautiful how we're just realizing we can look good, of course, not to the extreme long term, but still we
Mhm.
can look good. And we do need to deal with repercussions or things that come from, excuse me, prolonged dieting. One question, and excuse my ignorance here, but you said secondary hypothalamic this is a very difficult word.
Yeah.
Luteal
Amenorrhea.
period,
Yeah.
essentially. Um,
Yeah.
why is it called secondary?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the HPA axis, basically it's not the first thing that happens. Usually there's an accumulation of stress that creates a downstream effect that basically shuts down FSH and LH and also shuts down progesterone. So hypothalamic amenorrhea is traditional term. I just call it secondary hypothalamic amenorrhea because it's not typically the first thing that happens. With the female physiology, usually your gut's impacted first, and then there's a downstream effect. So like a lot of people will try to separate, hormones from metabolism and all that kind of thing. But in the realm of helping women with that, what you're really dealing with is relative energy deficiency in sport, right? And when we unpack that, it can be carbohydrate efficiency as well. So I believe that the female physiology needs carbohydrates in order to keep some of the happy hormones healthy, such as like serotonin, GABA, progesterone, rest and recover, all that kind of thing. And the majority of women that experience hypothalamic amenorrhea, what essentially happens is that they have been underfueled for so long that the body can't even pull out 200 to 300 calories every time they're about to have a cycle to produce the cycle, because that's typically what it costs the female body. And if you're in a big enough debt, you just won't have a cycle.
That makes complete sense. And I mean, a lot of people listening will be kind of in that camp of probably overtraining, probably over restricting for too long in terms of food. What are some of the gut health symptoms that we might be seeing after a long time of doing both those things?
Yeah, so for the female physiology, I think it's important to note that typically the gut's impacted first. Now, this is typically only because that there's a reduction in calories. There's also an accumulation of stress on the physiology, and usually that can cause slowing down of the gut microbiome. So the way that I like to think about it is that the fat burning hormone that we have access to that we can kind of regulate up and down is called leptin, right? And it's important to note that carbohydrates fuel the hormone leptin. So you can have leptin high, you can have leptin low, but regardless, if it's high, you're probably more of like a fat burning machine, right? If it's very low, you kind of are shutting down your body's ability to burn body fat. Now, there's also something called leptin resistance, which is typically where you'll have a lot of obese, overweight individuals that are still complaining that they're hungry. Um, but I mean, truthfully, if you're 300 pounds and you're complaining that you're hungry all the time, truthfully, you could not eat for 2 weeks and you'd be fine. You would probably, if you're dealing with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes or something like that, I mean, honestly, you'd probably give that thing a really swift kick in the ass and take control back over your life, if that's what you decided to do. But hard to get people to not eat for a week or 5 days or something like that. So, but those are usually like the things that I like to consider when we're talking about fat loss, is understanding that carbohydrates fuel leptin, which can upregulate or downregulate our body's ability to oxidize body fat. And so I try to keep that hormone as healthy as possible. But for a woman, when she decides to cut her carbohydrates, research has actually shown that there's like a 40 to 50% drop in leptin even after only 4 days of calorie restriction, right? So if you have a good amount of leptin and then you go on an aggressive diet, which most women never do refeeds, they don't do high carb days, they don't prioritize their nutrition, they don't properly periodize it, you can shut leptin down pretty quickly, in my opinion. And that ultimately leads us to these concepts that I talk about all the time, which is trying to diet smarter, right? So when we talk about dieting smarter, we're talking about what are all the evidence-based tools that we have available to us? Like, let's just go look at what Dr. Campbell's doing at the University of South Florida. What's he talking about? The refeeds, the diet breaks, all these things. Why? It's because we can force glycogen in, we can also deplete glycogen out, and we can kind of pulse these things in and out, keeping leptin and the responses to leptin from carbohydrate as optimal as possible for fat loss. But I would say for women, though, like the gastrointestinal tract is usually the first thing that's impacted. And the way that it presents itself is I'm not going to the bathroom every day. I feel kind of bloated. Like, what's going on here? I didn't go to the bathroom this morning. Maybe 2 days passed. I still haven't gone to the bathroom, but I feel bloated. I feel like I'm getting kind of less energy. Those are usually the very first things that I spot. Now, if you don't take action on those things, which could be something as simple as saying, hey, client, since you aren't going to the bathroom every day, let's just give you a short, maybe 3-day diet break or a short 3 days of refeeding. Let's make sure we can add in some magnesium, maybe 300 to 500 milligrams of magnesium. If you need it in the morning, you can do it in the morning. If you need it at night, you can do it at night. Either way, what we're trying to do is get the bowels moving. Psyllium husk can also be tremendous. Aloe vera can also be tremendous. But we got to make sure that the female body is properly detoxing itself every day. Because if it's not properly detoxifying itself, it's phase 1, phase 2, which is the liver and the gastrointestinal tract, all that food that you're eating can essentially become bound up in the large intestine. And this is how bacterial overgrowth happens. This is how things like SIBO happen. And then you have women that don't look like they're holding a lot of weight, but if they turn to the side, it just looks like they have a very extended stomach. And so in the gut health space, and I don't claim to be a gut health expert by any means, but in the physique development space, this is what we see a lot of, is because you're stressing the body so much, you're only eating 1,000 calories a day, you're exercising or training 5 days a week, plus the cardio. That's usually the first thing that we see. So I think it's very important to, if you're somebody who's going through that, add in a diet break, increase your water, your electrolytes, add some magnesium to it, and just make sure that you're going to the bathroom every day. I think that would be the most important piece.
That's a really good thing to look out for and something reasonably easy to spot. And I mean, those
Yeah.
are with the same type of people, and I fall into that category also in the sense of being
Mm-hmm.
type A and being stressed, and you're just like tight all around, and so of course the
Mm-hmm.
tight transfers over to your stomach, to your intestines, and then it kind of makes it more difficult.
Yeah, that's another reason why I'm such a big advocate of, like, if you're typical, I guess what you would call like sympathetic driven, so just very high stress type A, like do something that requires you to relax in the morning. Now, it could be something as simple as, hey, wake up, drink your 300 milligrams of magnesium with 20, 30 ounces of water and go for a walk. Cool thing about walking is you can't do nothing else but walk. If you're like trying to walk and you look at your phone or something, you could run into a stop sign or a tree or something. Like your phone's going to be in your pocket or leave it at home, but you can just walk. And normally with that, what you're really doing is you're allowing all those electrolytes, the fluids, the magnesium to get down into your pipes, start to break some stuff down, start to move some stuff. And then usually when you get back home, you can go to the bathroom. The other thing that I would say that's so helpful is so many people wake up, caffeinate, put themselves in a dark room and just turn the computer on and start working. I'm a really big fan of getting sunlight on the body and on the face first thing in the morning to basically help make sure that the adrenal glands are releasing cortisol when they're supposed to, and you don't end up with like a flip-flop circadian rhythm, which is basically a point where you feel exhausted in the morning and then you have energy at night, because that's when you're shining all the lights on your face. So with that being said, usually if you could create and stick with a really good morning routine, a lot of the gastrointestinal stuff usually takes care of itself. But again, I don't claim to be a gut health expert. I just really try to focus on the basics, and usually the basics 95% of the time will work.
And so, aside from, of course, increasing calories and so on, what are some of the strategies that you employ to help women get their period back or have more regular cycles?
Yeah, for the cycle, it's multifold. But I think as a nutrition coach, what we have to understand is that we only have so many interventions that we're in control of, right? So we have the nutrition intervention, we have the supplementation intervention, we have the training and cardio intervention. And then if you can control it, usually we also have access to a lifestyle intervention, right? And so to be able to regain the cycle, I think first and foremost, it starts psychologically, because unless you mentally prepare yourself for what's going to come, for some women, it can be really challenging because they've identified themselves and kind of psychologically are tied to nobody's going to work harder than me. I've been, training no days off for 6 to 12 months. I've only eaten 1,000 calories. Nobody's dieting harder than I am. I'm waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I'm seeing my personal trainer and my boot camp instructor, and I'm doing all the stuff, right? The hardest part is to get them to take their foot off the gas. But most of the time, they know they need to take the foot off the gas. They just don't have somebody like me that comes in and basically tells them that's what they need to do to get it back, right? So a lot of people have thoughts and opinions and ideas. But if I can stand in front of you and I can tell you, look, I've done this hundreds of times, right? Like this is what needs to happen. And granted, everybody's case is a little bit different and it's unique. Like I'll provide two examples really quick, and then I'll get to the nuts and bolts of it. But I've worked with women that have only lost their period for like 6 months. I've also worked with women that have lost their period for over 6 years, never having one. And so when you understand that, you have to think, how long is it going to take for them to get it back, right? The woman who just lost it because she was dieting really hard for a show or a photo shoot or something like that, she'll probably get it back rapidly, around 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months. The woman that hasn't had it for 6 years, I mean, that's my longest case ever. And it took us 9.5 months to get her period back, right? In a natural sense, right? It took us 9.5 months to get it back where there was no supplements. She had a cycle. And then at that point, I needed 6 consecutive before I could diet her again, right? And so if I could create a list of things, so we'll start with the lifestyle intervention first. Trying to maximize your sleep quality, probably the most important thing, right? A lot of chronically stressed out gals or gals that are doing too much, they're under recovered and thus lack sleep because progesterone is typically so low throughout that duration of time. They've probably became estrogen dominant, which is kind of similar to like a woman going through perimenopause where they wouldn't be able to sleep really well, the night sweats and all that kind of thing. And if you need to, magnesium at night before bed, or like maybe even adding in some ashwagandha, something like that. And then even maybe stacking 5 to 10 milligrams of melatonin on top of that would probably be a really good idea to just knock her out. And sometimes I'll try to attack that a bit harder because I know that's like the lowest hanging fruit, right? So sleep from a lifestyle perspective, very important. Secondly, I'd probably go ahead and unpack training. So most gals that I have historically worked with from the bodybuilding space are just doing too much exercise. And I think it's just too much volume. I don't think it's the amount of days. And I also don't think it's the intensity. I think it's the overall volume that a lot of the programs are being created nowadays that are being put out there. They're usually 5 days. You're training everything twice a week, or sometimes glutes 3 days a week and all that kind of stuff. I think we have to be able to fuel and nourish the physiology enough to be able to train like that. But most women are not, because they're pairing high volume training, high frequency training with very low calories. So second thing that I would do is pull back on the volume and also probably pull back on the frequency. If you're training 5 days, I probably drop you down to 3 or 4. And then however much of volume you're doing, I'm probably cutting volume in half. Okay. That's the other thing. From a nutritional perspective, I would most likely reset your calories back up to whatever I felt your theoretical maintenance level was at that time. Now, I'm not increasing the calories to get you to gain back a lot of unwanted body fat unless you're just way too lean, right? Like if we're talking about a woman that's just got done with a photo shoot or a bodybuilding show or something, we would theorize, okay, she's super shredded. Yes, we got to get 8 to 10 pounds back on you in order to have enough energy availability to fuel the systems that need to be fueled. So the nutrition would be back up to a theoretical maintenance level. Most important in that process would probably be making sure that there's a good amount of fiber in the diet so we can optimize phase 1, phase 2 detoxification. We would also want to make sure that there's enough healthy fats in the diet. So normally women that are dieting, they're in the evidence-based range, which is like 35 to 50 grams of fat. Most of the time, I am taking them at least to 60, 65, 70, sometimes 75, 80. It just depends on how much help I think their hormones actually need. And then from a subset of that, you could potentially consider, hey, I'd really like for you eating, at least 2 meals of like salmon per week, 2 meals of like sirloin steak per week, at least a couple meals of whole eggs, omega-3 fatty acids, all the really good fats that they need to ramp up cholesterol to send signals through the hormonal cascade. That's probably the most important piece. Is protein important? Yeah, but I would say I would just keep it in an evidence-based range. Usually for most ladies, between 120 and 150 is a good general recommendation. And for carbohydrates, I would go no less than 150. From a supplementation perspective, this is where you kind of have to know what you're doing. So if I got a gal that was, you know, if she was experiencing amenorrhea, I'm already assuming it's because she's an aggressive dieter. So I'm already assuming that she may be suboptimal thyroid. I'm assuming she has low progesterone. I'm assuming she's estrogen dominant. I'm assuming she may be borderline anemic, a lot of different things kind of. I'm also probably assuming that she has high cortisol or high reverse T3, something like that. These are the general things I see. And so I would get blood work done on the client. And I typically go through life extension. I like the life extension weight loss comprehensive panel. And I also have a lab here at the office that I utilize. And we've kind of manufactured our own set of labs depending on what kind of client we're working with. Like if we have just an overweight and obese client, we have a lab for them. If we have a more of like a metabolically adapted client, we have a lab for them. And then if we have a client that may have a deeper issue, something like they're producing antibodies and they've got Hashimoto's or something, we have another lab for that as well. But the labs tell me everything I need to know. And then generally when I'm looking at the labs, I then know what hormones do I need to be able to support until we get the cycle back. So it may be something like elevating your thyroid health, but obviously that's probably going to happen majority through the increase in calories and resting and dropping stress and all that kind of thing. But we may add in a thyroid support. We may add in something to help with the androgen production because typically low testosterone in the natural women that I help is very closely connected. So we'd probably add something in, maybe like fenugreek or something like that to help with testosterone, maybe some boron. And then the most important thing is we have to support stress with probably ashwagandha, rhodiola rosea, magnesium, all that kind of stuff. And then the thing that's going to drive progesterone. So if it's not as serious of a case, I may recommend something like maybe 2 servings of chaseberry per day, something like that. And then if it's more of an extreme case, I'd probably go the route of bioidentical progesterone. But I only like to play in 3 realms. I like to say that there's 4. But the 4th realm is all the hormone replacement therapy. BHRT is step 3. Step 1 is like just adjusting macros, training, lifestyle, cardio, all that. Step 2 is adding in some over-the-counter stuff, and then step 3 is bioidenticals. Step 4 is, well, we need an HRT clinic, And I don't usually dabble in that because I myself am a natural bodybuilder and I've stayed natural my entire life. So with that being said, I try to emphasize that with my clients as well as if you don't need to inject the hormone, let's try to get it back operating on its own without that, because once you start it, it's going to be very hard to come off of it. And then the other thing I would definitely say is dropping cardio at least in half, dropping cardio in steps. And usually that is the recipe for getting your period back. And it works very, very well.
Well, thank you so much for laying that out in such detail. I really appreciate that, and I know that the listeners are gonna love having that much detail. And
Yeah.
I mean, I personally, I lost my cycle when I was on hormonal birth control for about, I don't know, 15 years or whatever, or 10 years.
Yeah,
Um,
it does that. Yeah, it does that. I mean, all birth control makes women estrogen dominant and it shuts down your progesterone, usually through progestin supplementation, right? So that's to be expected. So any women that are listening to this that, they're like, oh, I got on birth control, but I didn't have a cycle. It's to be expected.
Yeah, and at that stage, I was like actually happy about it. I was like, oh, this is so
Hmm.
cool, one thing less to worry about. And then I learned more and more about it and how important it is and how some of my symptoms, in the sense of not really feeling like myself, etc., were likely connected with that as well.
Yeah.
anyway, what I wanted to say with this is it took me probably a year and a half after that to have a an irregular cycle.
Oh, well.
But also because throughout that time I was doing shift work as a police officer. I was training sometimes twice a day.
No kidding.
But I was not under fueling. That was the one thing I had going for me. But
Mhm.
aside from that, with 3, 4 hours on average of sleep and all that, like it was just horrible. So it took me a while to just get irregular cycles back. And then even there, it took me probably another year and a half or more to actually get somewhat of a regularity going there. So yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, for anyone listening, patience is definitely something that we need. And I sometimes heard that for every year that you were on hormonal birth control, you can kind of assume like a month that it could take for the cycle to come back potentially. I don't know if there's any truth to this rule of thumb. Probably depends a lot
Yeah,
on what you're
I
doing.
don't know. I mean, I think what really matters is what is the woman doing when she decides to come off. So I'll
Hmm.
give you an example of what a big problem that I see in our industry is people that they're just not aware, right? And when you're not aware, you don't know any better. So therefore, why would you change anything? So I guess what I'm trying to do is create awareness for those folks that are wanting to begin to help women with some of the hormone related issues that they're experiencing, and just knowing better. So for reference, if I had a client and she's like, William, I'm really thinking about coming off of birth control, I say, okay. But let's just say I'm just quote unquote like a macro coach and I know calories in, calories out, but I don't pay attention to biofeedback. I don't know anything about hormones. I don't know anything about metabolic adaptation, but I know how to manipulate calories to get fat loss, right? And the woman would say, I'm coming off birth control. And you could say, okay, well, what kind of birth control are you on? She's like, I'm on an estrogen progestin base. And you'd say, okay, the estrogen is making her more estrogen dominant, clearly, but then it's also shutting down progesterone with the progestin. So therefore, she kind of becomes estrogen dominant by default, right? Now, when she comes off the birth control, if she's feeding herself appropriately and already doing all the stuff that I just told you in detail, she's probably going to get her cycle back pretty quick, right? Because she's doing all the right stuff. But if you're a traditional macro coach and that's all you're paying attention to, oh, Sally, go ahead, come off your birth control, but we're going to keep dieting you. By the way, lower your carbohydrates another 20 grams and add in another 10 minutes of cardio at every cardio session. How in the hell can hormones thrive if you dramatically reduce energy intake? They can't. This is why metabolic adaptation happens in the first place, right? This is the same reason why when men would go into a bodybuilding contest prep as a natural, our testosterone could go from like 700, 800 down to 100. And then we say, well, what is metabolic adaptation? Well, it's pretty much staring you in the face, right? It's our body's ability to, well, technically, it's what it really is, in my opinion, is all of the hormonal adaptations that happen to the physiology because of the restriction. But how do we identify what adaptation actually is? This is where I think we need lab work to actually be able to show the client this is where you were before you started fat loss. Look at all your levels. They're beautiful. You know, your testosterone, your thyroid, your sex hormones, your everything looks good. Lose 20 to 30 pounds of body fat, get them super lean, get labs again. If she's still having a cycle, get labs done again. Now look, this was the side effect of your efforts. So now what do we have to do to bring those things back? Well, we have to create a protocol. We have to assign that protocol. Client has to follow it. And then 3 to 6 months later, we do labs again to make sure we got you back to where you were. But if you're not doing that part, you're just crossing your fingers and saying, trust the process when I can't trust the process because there's no data that I can trust.
It's
You know what I mean?
a really, really good point. I love that. And I think yeah, as you said, many people or many coaches might just literally just look at the numbers and yeah, cut another 20 grams or let's add another 20 minutes of cardio and so on. And that can get really dangerous. And I mean, you mentioned that this whole process of trying to regain the cycle and so on is somewhat similar to a woman going through perimenopause or with menopausal symptoms. Maybe you can elaborate on that as well. And if your strategies in terms of optimizing hormonal health or at least trying to assist hormones throughout that time would be similar.
from a lifestyle perspective, a lot of it's similar, but from a hormone perspective, based off of each client, it could be radically different. So what I was referring to was, if let's just say this, I think a lot of women that are chronic dieters, high stress, not sleeping well, maybe their moms operating companies, they've got kids, they're married, they got a lot of stuff going on. They're still trying to keep up with their health because they want to look good. They want to be a good representation of health and wellness for their families. But even a woman in her late 30s that nobody would assume she's in perimenopause, it would kind of look like she's in perimenopause if she was to get lab work done and she's just metabolically adapted. So I've seen blood work from women in their 20s that look like they're going through perimenopause, but it's just because the hormones that should be elevated are shut down. Right. So mainly the one that I would be focusing on would be progesterone. But again, I've seen low progesterone in 15, 18, 25, 31, 35-year olds, 40, every age I've seen low progesterone. The ones that you probably want to look more at, though, to identify if they're in perimenopause would be follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, to just look and see like what are those two doing. The other thing that you would see is like a gradual decline in progesterone. So that's the calming hormone in the female physiology, which is also, I believe, strongly rooted as to why the evidence supports that most women that go through the perimenopausal transition will gain body fat and lose lean body mass. And most of the fat that they gain is abdominal. It's around the core. It's the love handles. It's the lower back. It's the stomach, right? And they're like, my waist has grown 3 inches in the last, year, and I have no idea what's going on. So, as far as menopause goes, I think those things are the most important. Is to understand, number one, what type of interventions are you applying to your life now? Are you not eating enough, which is very common? Or is your body not properly detoxifying itself? Are your hormones not quote unquote balanced? And all I mean by balanced is your estrogen to progesterone ratio in a good place? A lot of women, when they go through the transition, they'll go see their gyno, and the gynecologist will put an estrogen patch on them. And normally the estrogen patch is like a 0.7 or a 1.0 or something like that. And if they don't also prescribe them progesterone, then that estrogen that they currently have could kind of become like exacerbated, and then they become further estrogen dominant, which is why I believe when women get estrogen patches, most of them will gain weight without really changing too much. They start to put on maybe 10, 15 pounds over the course of like 6 months. And then they're like, what's going on? Now, if they have low progesterone, a smart doctor would say, yeah, we have to keep this ratio, in a good place. Or from the estrogen progesterone ratio, you're looking at trying to keep it under 100. That's kind of like the ideal scenario. Well, you want to keep it as close to 100 or over 100 as possible. Sorry. Anything under 100, I would classify as estrogen dominant, which typically the side effect of that is like maybe you have some more bloating, maybe you're having some painful cycles, if you're still having cycles when you have the cycles. And then the other thing is the actual, like the fat gain that can come along with it. But I think if you keep estrogen and progesterone in a good range, which trying to provide like medication or progesterone support, you'd probably want to keep your progesterone between like a 10 and a 15 if possible. From an estrogen, I've seen less than desirable outcomes if the estrogen's over like 200. So 200, then you have 250s, 300s, 350s, 550s. Last week I saw 550 with a 0.5 progesterone. This week I saw 380 with a 0.4 progesterone. And I always see that kind of stuff. And they wonder, like, how come I can't lose body fat? And I'm like, the hormones aren't the reason you can't lose it, but they're not helping you, you know? So as far as perimenopause goes, I think what most women should consider, number one, is let's make sure that we can put you through a health focused process where we can detoxify your liver, your gastrointestinal health, make sure you're walking, make sure if you are addicted to caffeine that you're cutting back on caffeine. Make sure that you are still resistance training, but not as often, maybe 3 days a week, so something like that. Doing a lot of parasympathetic activity. You're talking like walking, maybe yoga, Pilates, all that kind of stuff. And most of the time, if you can control stress really well, a lot of that stomach fat will begin to go away. And that's at least what I've began to explore. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert at it right now because I'm always trying to learn brand new things. And I'm trying to apply those things. And then when I find things that really work, I try to teach other people those things. But yeah, the perimenopause transition is highly predicated on the woman and what she's experiencing, because my approach for one woman wouldn't be the same as another woman, just because of the fact that like I don't know their history and I have to learn their history in order to create a plan for them.
Well, I think that makes your coaching so great that it's such an individualized approach. And I mean, while we can have like methods in general or principles in general, we do need to consider each individual and their scenario, as you said. And you were hinting at some of the research that Bill Campbell is doing. And I
Yeah.
think it was just in this last research review where he was actually looking at a study in regards to menopause that clearly demonstrated that change in distribution of body fat and lean body mass, so not necessarily in weight overall, but just the
Mm-hmm.
distribution, which is of
Yeah.
course a little bit shocking to some extent, but I think to another extent for women that have gone through perimenopause or menopause, it is also reassuring just knowing like, hey, it's not in your head, it's not something that you're telling yourself that's like wrong with you, it's just something that a change in your hormones that elicits a bit of a redistribution of your body fat, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I would also mention that because of the work that I've done, I know firsthand that you can still remain in control of it. Yeah, and I think that's the powerful piece.
Exactly.
I think a lot of men and women. So men go through something called andropause, as well, and then you have the females going through menopause. But for women specifically, I think that if you decide to reach out to somebody that can help you navigate the process, you're putting yourself into such a good place where you could potentially avoid spending way more money after menopause when your hormones are all crazy, you've gained a bunch of body fat, and then now you're insulin resistant, you've got inflammation problems, you've got all this stuff going on. You're like, I feel terrible. Then you got to go see a doctor, and then and then they're probably going to put you on all these medications and hormones and all that kind of thing. I would highly suggest like get a grip of your health before you enter it. So like by the time you're 40, I mean you need to be doing all like the right stuff. And I don't mean calorie restricting. I mean trying to build as much muscle mass and strength as possible. Fueling yourself appropriately, trying to eat more of an anti-inflammatory diet, making sure that your lifestyle is as good as possible. And it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Because I know that if I laid all this stuff out on a list, you'd be like, oh my God, I have to check all these boxes every single day. This is exhausting. But truthfully, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to be consistent and doing the right things to help you feel well. The biggest thing that I hear from a lot of women that are over 40 is that fact that, like, look, I don't even care if I lose any weight at this point. I just want to feel like myself again. And so, what I like to do is I like to try to make people feel better first. And feeling better has all to do with your hormone balance and your internal health.
Hmm.
It's resetting the adrenals, it's detoxifying the system, it's eating healthy foods. Because keep in mind, the foods that we put into our body can dramatically alter our genetics and how we feel. Right. So I think that's probably the most important. And then lifting weights for the bone health and for the lean body mass gain, eating a high protein diet, and just really taking care of yourself, trying to manage stress the best as possible, hanging out with your girlfriends and laughing and doing maybe some yoga here and there, lifting weights here and there, maybe doing some walks or some runs, and doing what the things you're supposed to do to avoid the potential for metabolic dysfunction as you're going through menopause or after menopause. Um, and that's across the board. I mean, that's for, men and women, but I think most of the time men get so caught up in trying to build their businesses and working and then taking care of the family. Like I have the same issue. I'm married, I have two companies and I have four kids. But like the working out's never been a negotiable thing. It's like, no, this is who you are. Like, do you, quote unquote, if I asked you, I said, Lisa, are you healthy? Right? You'd say, hell yeah, I'm healthy. You should see what I eat, the way that I live, the way that I exercise. You should see my physique. Of course I'm healthy. But you ask somebody that's not healthy, do you believe you're healthy? And they'll say, well, no. And I'm like, well, why? It's because I don't do the things that a healthy person does. You know what I mean? And so if you do the things more often, chances are you'll dramatically improve how you feel. Um, but that doesn't necessarily also say that if you're not feeling well, if you just do those things, you'll feel better. There may be something else that you may have to do to feel better. But most of the time, the foundations of health are always going to be the most important, and they can make a tremendous impact in your life. I just think people have to accept the fact that like this should be your lifestyle. And, eating out every day and drinking alcohol every day and not drinking water and not exercising probably is not a path to health.
I really, really like your message. And I think what I'm taking away a lot is consistency, is stress management, is just generally doing the basic lifestyle things on a consistent basis, as you mentioned. I think the one issue that sometimes arises is when people elicit some change and they start being healthier because they lost some weight, etc. And then they think more is better. And that's when we get
Mm-hmm.
into the more calorie restriction, more exercise, and then we have the other issues. So yes, I think being in that moderation, in that balance place, and that good stress management place, and that doing more things that are fun, that light your soul up, that get you feeling better, that's a really, really good approach.
Yeah, it's interesting because the amount of women that I've worked with that basically say, I'm leaner now than I was when I was doing what I was doing before, but I was doing way more. They're like, I was exercising way more. I was doing way more cardio. My calories were lower. Like, how is this possible? And I say, well, most likely you just shut down your body's ability to lose body fat at an accelerated rate because you were too aggressive. They're
Mhm.
like, too aggressive? What are you talking about? Too aggressive? I thought I was supposed to be aggressive. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I believe that specifically women's bodies, especially the perimenopause woman, the fat needs to be, it just needs to be a smarter, more intelligent approach. Like the fat loss needs to be smarter, more intelligent, and you have to give it more time. You want to think about, I'm not trying to like just get you into a calorie restriction overnight and just tell you to go no carb and do a bunch of exercise, because most likely that physiology doesn't have the resiliency to be able to recover from that stress. And the way that I identify, or at least kind of define the word health, is it's your body's ability to respond to an applied stressor. So fat loss is a healthy body. You apply a calorie deficit, you respond great to it, and you could then for kind of theorize in this moment that you are a healthy individual because you responded appropriately. If you apply that same stressor to somebody who is kind of metabolically dysfunctional, meaning that they're not healthy, they may not lose anything and their blood sugar may go up because it's more stress on their body. So we have to make people healthy again first. And I think if we can make people healthy again, then the expectation for fat loss later on is a lot more realistic.
Mm. Wonderful message. Thank you so much, William, for your time. I truly appreciate everything you have shared with us about how to regain our cycles, how to transition in a good way through menopause and everything else. So, truly, thank you so much. I will put all your handles in the show notes for sure. The Educated Dieter, I really highly recommend checking out William's Instagram as well with so much valuable information. But yeah, just truly thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for a great conversation. Obviously, it's a pleasure anytime I get the opportunity to meet somebody that's also in the nutrition coaching space. And I appreciate you taking your time out of your day to have this conversation and provide the value out there into the world for your audience.
Thank you.